The old bicycle repair shop had survived 4 decades of scorching summers, icy winters, and countless rainy seasons, but one violent overnight storm nearly accomplished what time never could. When I unlocked the warped wooden door that morning, rainwater still dripped from the cracked ceiling onto the concrete floor, and one side of my workbench had collapsed beneath a pile of broken shelves. Children's bicycles waiting for simple repairs leaned safely against the far wall, untouched by the damage, which somehow mattered more to me than the shattered shop around them. Before I could lift the first fallen plank, 8-year-old Tommy Henderson rushed through the doorway, carrying a tiny blue bicycle with a bent front wheel. His eyes were red from crying. "Mr. Sam," he whispered, "Dad said your shop got hurt. But do you think my bike can still be fixed?" If you have ever seen quiet kindness outlive hardship, stay with me for a little while. I smiled, wiped the rain from my hands onto an old shop towel, and carefully rolled Tommy's bicycle toward the only repair stand still standing. His father reached for his wallet before I even touched a wrench. Like every parent before him, he already knew what my answer would be. "Please," he said, "at least let me help after what happened here." I gently pushed the folded bills back toward him. "Use it to buy Tommy a new helmet instead." The man tried again. Every parent always did. I simply shook my head, straightened the damaged wheel, tightened the loose spokes, and adjusted the brakes until the little bicycle rolled smoothly once more. Tommy climbed aboard outside the shop and laughed as though the storm had never happened. His father thanked me quietly before they disappeared down Maple Street. I watched them leave until the sound of spinning tires faded into the morning. Only then did I turn back toward the wreckage inside my shop. My old workbench had been with me longer than most of the bicycles I repaired. As I lifted one of its broken support boards, something slid across the dusty floor and stopped beside my boot. It was an envelope, yellow with age, sealed and tucked so deeply beneath the bench that no one could have seen it unless the storm had forced the wood apart. Across the front, written in careful blue ink that had faded with time, were only 4 words: "For Samuel, when ready." At that exact moment, a young woman holding a notepad stepped cautiously through the open doorway. "Mr. Brooks?" she asked. "I'm Emily Carter from the Maple Ridge Gazette. I came to cover the storm damage." Her eyes settled on the unopened envelope resting in my hands. "Is that important?" she asked softly. I looked at the familiar handwriting for a long time before answering. It has been waiting for me longer than anyone in this town knows. Emily hesitated before asking the question no one had ever asked me before. "Then, why haven't you opened it?" I gently slipped the envelope back beneath the edge of the damaged workbench, almost exactly where it had rested for decades. "Because," I answered quietly, "some promises become easier to keep when you never learn how they began." Emily returned the following afternoon, carrying a recorder she rarely switched on. She quickly realized that no interview could explain what everyone in Maple Ridge seemed to accept as perfectly ordinary. Parents wandered into my damaged shop almost hourly with bicycles balanced in truck beds, hanging from bicycle racks, or pushed by children whose knees were still dusty from playground falls. Every conversation followed nearly the same pattern. A parent thanked me. A child smiled nervously while I inspected loose chains, worn brake pads, or bent handlebars. The repair quietly disappeared beneath steady hands and familiar tools. Then, just before leaving, the parent reached for a wallet. Every time I gently refused. Emily filled page after page with the same unanswered question: why? By late afternoon she stopped asking me, and began asking everyone else instead. Mrs. Patterson, whose twins were now college students, laughed softly. Mr. Sam fixed their bicycles every spring. We stopped trying to pay after the third year. Ben Morales, now captain at the local fire station, rolled his own weathered mountain bicycle into the shop, though it barely needed attention. When I was 11, he told Emily, my mom was working 2 jobs. I snapped my chain trying to ride across the old railroad crossing. Mr. Sam repaired it before dinner and slipped a bell onto my handlebars. He said every kid deserved to hear a happy sound while riding home. Emily asked whether he had ever learned why. Ben shook his head. He always answered the same way. Emily looked toward me as I adjusted his brakes. What did he say? Ben smiled before repeating words he clearly had not forgotten in more than 30 years. Someday you'll understand. Just help somebody else when it's your turn. Emily heard that sentence again before sunset. A retired teacher remembered it. A postal carrier repeated it almost word for word. Even Tommy's father quietly admitted he had heard exactly the same promise when he was a little boy, bringing his own bicycle into this very shop. The stories came from different decades, different neighborhoods, and different families, yet they all ended with the same simple instruction. It sounded less like an explanation than something carefully rehearsed over a lifetime. As evening settled over Maple Ridge, Emily helped me stack damaged lumber from the storm into neat piles behind the building. She glanced toward the cracked workbench where the yellow envelope still rested beneath one loose board. That sentence, she finally said. Did it come from whoever wrote the letter? I paused longer than usual before answering. No. Then where did it come from? I gently brushed sawdust from the old bench with the palm of my hand, from someone who never asked me to remember his name. Emily frowned, sensing that the answer created an even larger mystery than the one she had started with. As we prepared to lock the shop, she noticed something tucked inside a dusty corner cabinet. A tiny, rusted bicycle with faded blue paint, far too small for any child in town today. One handlebar still carried a cracked leather grip, wrapped carefully with ancient twine. Mr. Sam, she asked quietly, whose bicycle is that? I looked toward the forgotten little bicycle, and for the first time all day, I couldn't answer immediately. The little blue bicycle remained exactly where Emily had found it, tucked into the dusty corner cabinet, as though it had been waiting for someone patient enough to notice it. Its frame was scratched almost to bare metal. One pedal had been replaced with a different color decades earlier, and the leather grip wrapped in faded twine looked as though careful hands had repaired it long before replacement parts were easy to find. Emily knelt beside it, running one finger gently across the handlebars without disturbing the thin layer of dust. You've kept hundreds of bicycles over the years, she said. Why this one? I reached for an old cloth before answering, wiping the frame with the same care I gave every child's bicycle that entered my shop. Because this one reminds me who I was before anyone called me Mr. Sam. Emily waited quietly. She had already learned that silence often uncovered more truth than another question. I lifted the tiny bicycle onto the repair stand, even though it no longer needed repairing. The familiar motion felt almost ceremonial. I was 10 years old, I finally said. My mother worked long hours cleaning motel rooms after my father passed away. We couldn't afford much beyond rent and groceries. Every afternoon I walked 3 miles to school because bicycles belonged to other children. Emily lowered her notebook without realizing it. This story no longer felt like an interview. It felt like something entrusted. One Saturday, I continued, a neighbor gave me this bicycle after his own son outgrew it. It wasn't pretty, but it was the first thing that had ever felt completely mine. I smiled faintly at the memory, before my expression softened again. 3 days later, I crashed trying to avoid a delivery truck. The front fork twisted, both wheels bent, and I thought I'd lost the greatest gift I'd ever received. Emily looked toward the damaged workbench where the sealed envelope still rested beneath the loose board. She seemed certain the story was moving toward it, yet she never interrupted. I pushed the bicycle nearly 4 miles into another town because someone told me there was an old mechanic who fixed bicycles. I didn't have a single dollar. I paused as though I could still feel those long miles beneath my feet. When I finally reached his shop, I told him I'd come back someday, after I earned enough money. Emily asked softly, "What did he do?" I smiled. He didn't answer immediately. He repaired everything while I sat on an overturned milk crate watching him work. He even replaced the broken grip with that piece of leather still tied to the handlebar. Emily looked closely at the weathered leather wrap. It had suddenly become far more valuable than any expensive bicycle part. When he finished, I continued, I asked how much I owed him. My hands rested on the handlebars as though they still belonged to the frightened little boy I once had been. He simply smiled and said, "Someday you'll understand. Just help somebody else when it's your turn." Emily slowly closed her notebook. Those are the exact words everyone keeps repeating. I nodded. Yes. She glanced toward the hidden envelope once more. Then the man who repaired this bicycle, was he the one who wrote the letter? I looked at the faded handwriting beneath the broken workbench, and for the first time in many years, I realized I could no longer pretend the answer did not matter. The shop felt quieter after I finally spoke about the little blue bicycle. Emily no longer looked around the room searching for a dramatic headline. Instead, she studied the ordinary things I had handled every day for decades. The worn repair stand, the chipped coffee mug beside my toolbox, the pegboard filled with neatly arranged wrenches, and the weathered workbench that still sheltered the unopened envelope. It was as though the entire shop had become one long conversation waiting to be understood. She helped me finish cleaning the storm damage before asking another question. "Did you ever see that mechanic again?" I rested both hands on the edge of the rebuilt workbench. "Only one more time," Emily waited. I rode back a week later after borrowing $1 from my uncle. I thought I was finally going to pay him. A faint smile crossed my face. The building was empty. She frowned. "Gone?" I nodded. The windows were boarded up. A hardware store owner across the street told me the old mechanic had become too sick to keep working. Someone said he moved away to live with family. Nobody knew where. Emily glanced toward the yellow envelope. "So you never thanked him?" "Not in person." I carefully reached beneath the loose board and lifted the envelope into the afternoon light. The paper felt almost weightless, yet it carried more years than many people carried memories. About 2 months later, a delivery driver handed this to my mother. There wasn't any return address, just my name. Emily looked at the faded blue handwriting again. "You knew it came from him?" "I believed it did." "Then why didn't you open it?" Instead of answering immediately, I walked to an old wooden shelf near the back wall and removed a small glass jar filled with worn bicycle bells. Every bell inside had come from bicycles whose young owners had outgrown them years earlier. Before a child left my shop with a repaired bicycle, I often let them choose one if I had a spare. The tradition had become so common that most families assumed I simply liked hearing bells ring through town. Emily watched as I gently turned one of the tiny brass bells between my fingers. "The day I received the letter," I said quietly, "I realized something." She remained silent. If I opened it looking for gratitude, I might accidentally make his kindness about me. I set the bell back into the jar, but if I spent my life repeating what he had done, then every repaired bicycle would become my thank you. Emily looked from the bell jar to the unopened envelope and finally understood why neither had ever changed places. The envelope held words. The bicycles had become actions. That realization changed the story she thought she was writing. She had arrived expecting to uncover a forgotten secret. Instead, she had discovered a promise still being lived every single day. Just as she closed her notebook, a white pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. 3 contractors stepped out, slowly studying the storm-damaged roof. One of them quietly handed me an estimate for the repairs. I read the final number only once before folding the paper in half. Emily noticed my expression change. "It's worse than you expected?" I smiled politely, though I could already feel the answer settling in my chest. "Much worse." She glanced at the estimate, then back at the tiny bicycles waiting for repair along the wall. For the first time, she realized the greatest threat to the promise had never been the unopened letter. It was the possibility that this little shop might not survive long enough for another child to hear the words that had changed my life. I folded the contractor's estimate and slipped it into the pocket of my work apron before Emily could see the numbers again. She did not ask to read it. She only watched my face, and that was enough. After 40 years of repairing bent wheels and broken chains, I had become fairly good at hiding disappointment from children. Apparently, I had never learned how to hide it from adults. The following morning, I unlocked the shop before sunrise, just as I had every weekday since opening the business. The roof still leaked in 2 places, so I set empty buckets beneath the steady drips before arranging the day's repair tickets. There were 11 bicycles waiting. 8 belonged to children whose parents had already apologized for not being able to pay very much. 3 belonged to teenagers saving money for summer jobs. Looking across the room, I quietly realized something that surprised even me. I could probably repair every bicycle in the shop before lunch. What I could not repair was the building that sheltered them. Emily arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee instead of a notebook. She placed one beside my toolbox without mentioning the newspaper. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" she asked. I tightened the last bolt on a small red bicycle before answering. "Finish every repair that's already here. And after that, close the doors with a clean conscience." She stared at me as though she had misheard. "You're really going to let it end?" I smiled gently. "Buildings end. Promises don't have to." Before she could respond, the front bell rang. An elderly woman stepped inside holding a faded photograph instead of a bicycle. I recognized her immediately. Margaret Ellis had once walked her grandson to my shop every Saturday morning. She quietly placed the photograph on my workbench. It showed a skinny little boy grinning beside a patched blue bicycle nearly 30 years earlier. "That boy just became a father yesterday," she said. "He wanted me to bring you this." I smiled at the picture. "He always rode too fast down Oak Hill." Margaret laughed. "He still does." Then her smile slowly faded. "Mr. Sam, people are talking." I looked up. "About the storm?" She nodded. "About the estimate. Contractors have families too. News travels." Emily looked surprised. I was not. Small towns rarely kept practical secrets for very long. Margaret reached into her purse and carefully laid an envelope beside the old photograph. "My grandson asked me to leave this." I gently pushed it back toward her without opening it. "You know I can't." She sighed because she had expected exactly that answer. "It's not payment for bicycle repairs," she insisted. "It's gratitude." I smiled. "Gratitude doesn't need an envelope." She left with tears shining in her eyes. Emily watched the entire exchange in silence. "How many times has that happened?" she finally asked. "More than I can count. And you've always refused." "Every time." She leaned against the repaired workbench, clearly wrestling with something. Do you ever think refusing help keeps other people from honoring the promise too? Her question lingered in the quiet shop long after she spoke it. I had always believed accepting money would change the meaning of what I was trying to protect. But Emily was asking something different. What if refusing every helping hand also denied others the chance to carry kindness forward? Before I could answer, the town power flickered once, then failed completely. The shop fell silent, except for the steady drip of rain through the damaged roof. Across the room, another section of the weakened ceiling groaned loudly before dropping a shower of splintered wood onto the empty repair stand where the little blue bicycle had rested only minutes earlier. Emily instinctively grabbed my arm. I looked toward the fallen beams, then toward the old cabinet where the tiny bicycle now leaned safely against the wall. For the first time since the storm, I realized we might not have another week to decide the future. We might only have tomorrow. The building inspector arrived the next morning with quiet sympathy written across his face long before he spoke. He walked slowly beneath the sagging roof, measured the cracked support beams, examined the damage left by the storm, and finally removed his hard hat with a reluctant sigh. "Samuel," he said, "I can let you finish today's repairs, but after that I have to close the shop until the structure is made safe." There was no anger in his voice, only responsibility. I nodded before he finished the sentence, but because I had already reached the same conclusion. "You're doing your job," I replied. I'd make the same decision. Emily stood nearby without taking a single photograph. She understood that some moments deserved witnesses instead of cameras. News traveled through Maple Ridge before noon. Children who normally raced through the front door suddenly stepped inside quietly, as though entering a church. Parents lingered longer than usual, watching me adjust chains, straighten wheels, and tighten loose handlebars with the same steady rhythm I had followed for 40 years. Nobody mentioned the closure directly. They simply thanked me a little more carefully than before. By late afternoon, the last repair ticket lay empty on my workbench. I hung my apron on its familiar hook and looked around the shop. Every tool had its place. Every bicycle waiting for pickup was finished. Every promise I had already made had been kept. Emily walked toward the old workbench where the unopened envelope still rested beside the contractor's estimate. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. I looked around the room one final time before answering. "Tomorrow I lock the door." She lowered her eyes. "And the promise?" I smiled faintly. "Promises don't need buildings." That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone beside the little blue bicycle while rain tapped softly against the patched roof. I finally admitted something to myself that I had refused to consider for years. The promise had never required me to carry it alone. My fear had. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. When I opened the door, Ben Morales stood outside wearing his firefighter's work jacket. Behind him were two teachers, the postal carrier, Margaret Ellis, Tommy's parents, and nearly a dozen former customers spanning 3 generations. No one carried flowers. No one carried speeches. Instead, each person wheeled an old bicycle into the shop. Every bicycle had been repaired by my hands years earlier. Some still carried tiny brass bells from the old glass jar. Others wore faded stickers or patched seats that I instantly remembered installing. Ben smiled. "We thought you should see something before tomorrow." One by one, they leaned their bicycles along the walls until the shop looked almost exactly as it had on its busiest Saturdays decades earlier. Then Ben reached into his pocket and removed a folded index card. "Do you remember telling me to help somebody else when it became my turn?" I nodded. Last month, my crew repaired bicycles for children at the community shelter. A teacher stepped forward. My students collect used helmets every spring. The postal carrier smiled. I fix flat tires for kids on my route now. Margaret quietly added, my grandson repairs bicycles with his daughter every weekend. Emily slowly realized what I had not. The promise had already escaped the walls of the shop years ago. It had been traveling from person to person without needing my permission. Ben carefully placed the index card beside the unopened envelope. On it, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Promise passed forward." "We're not here to convince you to break your promise," he said. "We're here because we finally understand it." I looked from the card to the yellow envelope resting beneath my fingertips. For decades, I had believed opening that letter might somehow complete the story. Standing in that room, surrounded by lives quietly shaped through kindness, I began to wonder whether the letter had never been waiting for me at all. Perhaps it had been waiting for all of us. Morning sunlight filtered through the cracked roof the next day, painting long golden lines across dozens of bicycles standing shoulder to shoulder inside my little shop. They belonged to children who had grown into parents, parents who had become grandparents, and neighbors whose lives had quietly crossed mine in ways I had never fully understood. Looking at them together, I realized I had spent 40 years believing I was repairing bicycles, when perhaps I had really been helping hope find its way home, one child at a time. Emily stood beside the rebuilt workbench while the townspeople gathered silently outside. No speeches had been planned. No newspaper photographers waited nearby. That alone made the moment feel honest. Ben Morales stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box. "Before anything else happens today," he said, "there's one thing we all believe belongs to you." He placed the box on the workbench beside the faded envelope. Inside were hundreds of tiny handwritten notes collected overnight from former customers across Maple Ridge. Some had been delivered before sunrise. Others had arrived through the mail or slipped beneath the shop door. Every card finished the same sentence in a different way. "Because you helped me." One read, "I became the teacher who never lets a child feel invisible." Another said, "I learned that kindness can be practical." A firefighter wrote, "I stopped counting what people owed me and started noticing what they needed." I read only a handful before my vision blurred. Emily quietly closed the lid. "You don't have to read them all today," she whispered. "I think they've already said what matters." Ben gently picked up the yellow envelope. "Samuel," he said, "this was addressed to you." I looked around the room. Every face waiting there had somehow become part of the answer I had spent decades avoiding. Slowly, I nodded. Ben placed the envelope into my hands. For a long moment, I simply traced the faded handwriting with my thumb. Then, with more hesitation than strength, I carefully broke the brittle seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the writing remained surprisingly clear. I recognized the careful script immediately. My voice shook as I began reading aloud. "Samuel, if this letter has reached you, then I hope your bicycle carried you farther than mine ever carried me. You tried to pay me with $1 you could not afford. I knew then that your heart was already worth more than money. If you ever wonder how to thank me, do not look for me. Look for someone standing where you once stood. Help them without keeping score. If enough people do that, neither of us will ever truly disappear." Silence settled over the room. No one moved. No one needed to. The words were astonishingly simple, yet they explained everything I had refused to understand. The promise had never been about repaying one man. It had always been about making sure no act of kindness reached its final destination. Emily quietly wiped tears from her cheeks before speaking. "That's why you never opened it." I nodded slowly. I was afraid the letter might say something smaller than the promise I'd built around it. I smiled through tears. Instead, it asked for exactly the life I've been trying to live. Ben stepped forward once more, but this time he wasn't alone. The firefighter, the teacher, the postal carrier, Margaret Ellis, Tommy's family, and dozens of others, each placed one hand on a bicycle nearest them. "The promise isn't ending here," Ben said softly. "It's only changing hands." I looked across the room filled with bicycles, familiar faces, and generations connected by one quiet decision made long before any of us met. At last, I understood that the letter had never been hidden beneath my workbench. It had been unfolding in the lives of everyone standing before me. 6 months later, the old bicycle repair shop stood beneath a brand-new roof. Fresh paint covered the weathered walls, the windows gleamed again in the morning sun, and children's laughter drifted through the open doorway, just as it always had. Yet one important thing had changed. The hand-painted sign no longer read simply "Samuel Brooks Bicycle Repair." Beneath the familiar lettering, someone had carefully added a smaller line that reflected what the building had quietly become: the Promise Workshop. I never asked who painted the new words. Somehow they belonged there. The town had refused to let the building disappear. Contractors donated weekends. The hardware store supplied materials. Firefighters hauled lumber after their shifts. Teachers organized students to clean and repaint the walls. Families who had once wheeled battered bicycles into my shop now returned carrying paintbrushes, toolboxes, sandwiches, and stories. Nobody tried to repay a debt. They simply continued the promise in the only way that made sense. Emily's newspaper article appeared the week after the repairs were finished. The headline surprised me because it never mentioned the unopened letter. Instead, it read, "The Kindness That Refused to Stop." She understood that the real story had never been hidden inside an envelope. It had been written across 4 decades of ordinary mornings. Every Saturday afterward, the workshop filled with volunteers instead of customers. Ben Morales taught teenagers how to replace chains and adjust brakes. Retired mechanics from neighboring towns offered free lessons. Parents who had never held a wrench before learned alongside their children. Every repaired bicycle carried a small brass bell whenever one was available. The old glass jar no longer emptied because people kept bringing bells from attics, garages, and forgotten bicycles, waiting for another chance to be useful. One autumn afternoon, Tommy, now a little taller and far more confident, stood beside me repairing his very first bicycle without help. When he finished tightening the final bolt, he looked up proudly. "Do I charge him?" he asked, pointing toward another boy waiting nervously beside a scratched blue bicycle. I smiled, because I already knew the answer. "What do you think?" Tommy thought for only a second before shaking his head. He carefully rolled the repaired bicycle toward its young owner, handed him a tiny brass bell, and repeated words that had traveled farther than any bicycle ever could. "Someday, you'll understand. Just help somebody else when it's your turn." Hearing those words spoken in another young voice, I realized they no longer belonged to the old mechanic, or to me. They belonged to whoever chose to live them next. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I placed the faded letter inside a simple wooden frame. It hung above the rebuilt workbench, where children could see it every day. The letter remained open now, not because its journey had ended, but because its purpose no longer needed protecting. It needed sharing. Beside it rested the little blue bicycle, polished but never restored completely. The scratches remained, the mismatched pedal remained, the worn leather grip wrapped in faded twine remained. Perfection had never been its purpose. Memory was. Emily visited one final time before publishing her follow-up story. She looked around the busy workshop. smiling as volunteers worked beside children without anyone keeping track of hours, money, or recognition. "Do you ever wish you had opened the letter sooner?" she asked. I looked toward the framed pages glowing softly beneath the afternoon light. "No," I answered. "If I had opened it years ago, I might have read the words." I watched Tommy help another child ring a newly installed bicycle bell for the very first time. The bright sound echoed through the workshop, carrying laughter out into the street. Waiting taught me to become them. Emily quietly closed her notebook for the last time. She finally understood that some legacies are never inherited. They are practiced. And somewhere beyond the open workshop doors, another child pedaled confidently down Maple Ridge's quiet streets, carrying a repaired bicycle, a tiny brass bell, and a promise that would almost certainly reach someone neither of us would ever meet. That was more than enough. As the last bicycle bell echoed down Maple Ridge's quiet streets, I realized something the old mechanic had understood long before I ever did. Kindness is never measured by how much we give. It is measured by how many people continue giving after we are gone. Perhaps every one of us carries an unopened letter of our own. Maybe it is a promise someone once made to us. Maybe it is a small act of generosity we have never forgotten. Or maybe it is simply an opportunity waiting for us to become the person another stranger desperately needs. Wherever you are today, I hope this story reminds you that even the smallest kindness can travel farther than we will ever know. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, because every like helps these quiet stories reach someone who may need them today. If you enjoy stories about dignity, family, compassion, and the extraordinary strength found in ordinary people, I would be honored if you subscribed to Silent Honor and joined our growing community. And before you go, tell us in the comments, what is one act of kindness that changed your life forever? Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever life finds you, may you and your loved ones be blessed with good health, peace, and countless reasons to keep believing in the quiet goodness that still exists in this world. Until next time, take care of yourself, and if your turn ever comes, help somebody else.